Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Shaun Tabatt, and today we're diving into one of the most urgent topics facing the church today: faith deconstruction, spiritual disillusionment, and why so many are leaving the church and what might actually bring them back. My guest today is Nicholas McDonald, author of the brand new book, The Light in Our Eyes. It's a bold, honest, and dare I say, refreshingly hopeful book for anyone wrestling with doubt, deconstruction, or spiritual fatigue. Nicholas doesn't just analyze the problem, he's lived it. He writes as someone who has walked through disillusionment and found a way back, not just to church, but to the vibrant, life giving Jesus of the ancient gospel. Nick, we're going to shorten your name for the rest of the interview just so we can fit in more great answers to my questions. It's great to meet you. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, great to be with you, Shaun. Glad to be here.
Well, I think I'd love to start at the beginning and hear what inspired you to write The Light in Our Eyes. Was there a specific moment? Was it something you saw in church, culture? Like, what set you down the path for this message?
There are so many answers to that question. I saw a hole, I would say, in the way that we were speaking with people who had left the church. Over the past decade, over 40 million people have left the church. That's more people than came to Jesus in the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and the Billy Graham Crusades combined. So it's something that's extremely urgent. But something that Jim Davis and Michael Graham talk about in their book, The Great Dechurching, is that most of these folks who've left the church still subscribe to basic orthodoxy, still believe in the Trinity, still believe in the authority of Scripture, still believe in the atonement of Jesus. And I felt like I resonated with that because my own story is really about walking away from the church for a period of time, not because I was ready to leave Jesus, but because I didn't feel that the church experience I had in the American evangelical world, it didn't really map onto the mission of Jesus that I read about in the Bible. And so it really, for me, it wasn't about being disillusioned by leaders who sin or stumble or fall. I know that's a bad part of a lot of people's stories, but that never really fazed me. I just felt like, oh yeah, that makes sense. You put someone on a platform and they're going to screw up. But for me, it was that the project we were talking about, it didn't seem to match the project I read about in the Gospels of Jesus. And so I left the church for a period of time. And I know the conversation I needed to have 18 years ago. And it was not the conversation I was reading in all of the books and pamphlets and articles and podcasts we were gearing toward people who've left the church. And so that's why I wrote the book.
And, whether it's your own journey or just as you minister to people who've walked through their own deconstruction and reconstruction process, so to speak, like for folks, is it often like one thing that, like the straw that broke the camel's back, or is it a whole bunch of different things that just kind of came together and it kind of got to be too much and they started asking hard questions? Like, is there a common thread to these stories?
There's certainly some common threads. I try to differentiate between folks who are in that truly deconstructing phase and people who are just really disillusioned. Those are usually two different experiences that are had for two different reasons. And then, the word deconstructing is used so often. It can also be used for people who've totally rejected the faith, which is a different experience, or people who are, I've heard it used several times for people who are just expressing normal doubts about Christianity, something I think some of the hard questions we all ask about faith at some point. I will get a question sometimes, well, am I deconstructing? I was like, no, I think you're just, classic doubting. We can work through this. And so for me, anyway, the disillusionment category is the category that I think is probably most missing in our vocabulary. And for me, disillusionment means, yeah, you're probably one of those people I described. You're probably not doubting the resurrection of Jesus. You're probably not doubting maybe the authority of the Bible. And yet you feel disillusioned or unaligned with the project of American evangelicalism. And that's really a lot of my own story. So I grew up in a half Christian home. My mom had never gone to church in her life before. She became a Christian sitting on her bed reading the Gospel of John when I was 6 years old. And so she brought me and my six siblings to church every single Sunday. And, she just gave us what she was handed when she walked into the evangelical world. And for her, sort of what she understood as Christianity was, the gospel is, it's about getting our ideas right in every single facet of life. Here's the Christian way to think about dating. You have to court. Here's the Christian way to think about economics. We all think this. Here's the Christian way to think about literature and film and art. And it was actually the literature, film, and art piece that really got me later because I was a film major in college. And I felt like I don't know that I agree with the quote unquote Christian way to think about film and art. I sort of resonate more with other people. But what ended up happening is that I think the reason why we create all these categories is because we're trying to protect our children and the next generation from being led astray. But ironically for me, it did the opposite because I thought, oh, so if I don't agree with the Christians in my life about art, I don't have a Christian worldview. Oh, maybe I'm not a Christian. Maybe, and so it all sort of started to unravel it. If that is just as important as the Trinity or the resurrection, and you're taking all these matters of opinion and really culture, and you're making them matters of orthodoxy, then as soon as we tug against one, it all comes unraveling, and that's what happened for me. I would say with that particular movement.
Well, and I'd love to pull a little bit more on that thread. I really enjoyed the section of the book where you talk about going to worldview camp. And again, like my wife and I have raised 10 kids, still in process with that, very conservative homeschooling movements. And so very familiar with what you were describing. But it didn't exactly have maybe the intended effect with you attending that. I was just fascinated by especially what you learned when you went out to try to evangelize or witness to somebody at the mall.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Worldview Camp was a very interesting experience for me. As I said, something that I loved about Worldview Camp, I don't want to say all negative things, is that I got the message that Jesus cares about every facet of life. And I think that's true. And I think that's beautiful. And it's something I probably didn't really get in my Lutheran background growing up. The Lutheran sort of vibe I got was, every sermon sounded something like, there's a lot of good things Jesus wants you to do. You're never going to do those things. So good thing he died for you and you can go to heaven someday. It was, very touching, but not particularly inspiring to me as a young person. It didn't really give me a real vision for life. And the highlight of Worldview Camp was saying, actually, I think Jesus cares about all these things. The problem was that as I left sort of my very suburban, very white context, I started to realize, oh, actually, I think that's the way that just my particular demographic thinks about things, and we're calling that Christian. And that's when I started to waver a bit on what I thought. So one of the best experiences that I had actually was going abroad. So my last semester of college, I went abroad to study creative writing at Oxford University. And my ambition was to write children's literature. That was always a dream of mine, is to write children's literature. And so one of the first people you study when you're studying children's literature is you study C.S. Lewis, because he's a pioneer, really, of children's literature in a lot of ways. We don't think of him that way in Christian circles because we know him from Mere Christianity, but he started something with that. And so I read his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, and something about the way he came to faith as an artist really resonated with me. Something that he would say is, okay, all of us have this experience as artists of feeling, he used a German word, Sehnsucht. We have this feeling of Sehnsucht, which is it's a word we don't have in English. It's like a happy sadness. It's like a yearning that comes from experiencing beauty, but not being able to be part of it. And so he describes having that feeling when he was reading The Wind in the Willows as a child. And for him, he spent most of his life as an atheist. For C.S. Lewis, Christianity answered the question, why do I have that longing? Why is that inside of me? And that was something that really drew me back into the faith. And so I started attending a church in England. It was an Anglican church. They would have called themselves evangelical, but all of the cultural trappings I'd grown up with were not there. There was not the same thing. They were a different kind of evangelical. And so what I began to learn over time through seminary and wise mentors is that the American evangelical project is very, very different than the evangelical project all around the world. And in fact, so much so that oftentimes if you ask if you're an evangelical in Europe or elsewhere, they'll say, yes, not the American kind, a different kind, because they kind of have all these, this worldview package bundled with them, and we're not that same type of thing.
And I want to touch back briefly on something you already led us into. In terms of the kind of that spectrum of faith responses, and in the book you talk about like loyal, doubting, disillusioned, deconstructed, departed. I think a lot of us would tend to want to just label everybody with a broad brush of those folks are all deconstructing. And whether it's having conversations about this or in terms of like ministering to people, why is it important for us to maybe apply the right label? Because I feel like if we say everybody's just deconstructed and it's terrible, we're not probably going to have the right solution for, say, the hurting people that are in front of us.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So when I think of a proper deconstructor, I think of a conversation I've had with a few different people who I would say are truly in this space. And the metaphor that's been brought up to me several times is so I am somebody who I think of Christianity like a room, and it's been decorated for me. And it's my job to take down those decorations that I don't like and put up decorations that I like. Um, Now, hidden in that metaphor are a couple of assumptions, but the first is that you are the author of the Christian faith, which is something I think we should maybe examine. Um, I think that's a portion of the folks who've left the church. That's a pretty extreme case. I would say I truly was in that space when I was in college. I would say, yeah, I don't really believe in the authority of the Bible. I don't believe in the authority of the church. It's sort of me and Jesus. But I would also say that most of the folks who are in that space are probably not there. They're probably just disillusioned. And I think what can happen is that if someone who's feeling disillusioned with the church starts to think, oh, I'm deconstructing, and they begin to look at stories of people who have deconstructed and departed from the church online, I think this is hard to describe, but a process I feel like I see happening is their imaginations start to be formed by that. And they start to think, oh, if I feel disillusioned with the church, I must be in that camp of the person who's left the church. And that's the only path that we're really painting for you. Whereas something I really try to do in the book is to create different categories for your imagination, to be able to say, you can experience disillusionment in the church and you can find renewal after that. And I have lots of stories of folks, myself included, who've been disillusioned with the church, and that could be a healthy thing, and it could lead you into a renewed faith. It doesn't have to be that story that you read about online. And so that's where I feel like it's important for us to be able to say, are you really deconstructing, or are you just feeling disillusioned or experiencing doubt?
Well, and to pull on that thread a little bit more too, um, do you think people are also just trying to find some place to belong, like a group, somehow to label or identify ourselves? Because if we just look broadly at culture for the last few decades, there's a lot of pressure to question the country you grew up in, question your family, question the faith of your family, and when we lose all those moorings, it's just like where did I come from? What am I doing right now? Where am I going? It's hard to have a real trajectory in life. Is maybe some of the appeal to be like, hey, I'm part of this group. This is what I do. Like it's giving them a sense of identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit like a candy identity. It's pretty has an immediate effect of when you post something online and say, this is the crowd I'm part of, and you get lots of pats on the back. It has, spikes your insulin. It feels good for a moment. It's not very satisfying. That gets old, I think, after a little while. And so one of the things I really try to do, especially toward the end of this book, is invite folks into the fact that, you might get some good shallow affirmation from folks online, but I think what you're looking for is you are looking for a real community. And I think you're only going to find that real community in the church. And that may sound hard for some people who've been burned by the church, but the irony of being human is that we're most scarred by people and we can only really be healed by people. That's just the way it works in general. And so a lot of the practices I point to in the second half of the book are about entering into a real embodied community, not just something you can find online. And so, one of my favorite stories is my friend Joseph, who I write about toward the end of the book, where Joseph, he truly was in this deconstructing space. He graduated from Purdue University, super bright guy, also very muscular and intimidating. And, just sort of one of those guys where I started talking to him and I would say something and Joseph would say, why did you say that? And I was like, I don't know, Joseph, I'm just talking. Just don't even pay attention to what I'm saying. And, but Joseph, he had lots of big philosophical questions about faith, and he was finding some online answers But something else that Joseph did that his friends didn't do, who all left the church and totally departed from faith, is he started coming to Redeemer, the church where I'm a pastor, every single Sunday. And after 2 years of conversations with Joseph, and I would say Joseph, and he would say his faith feels totally renewed. He's really in a beautiful place with his family and as a leader in his church. But he would look back upon those 2 years and he would say, the most important thing for me in those 2 years was the fact that I would be at Redeemer every Sunday. I would confess my sin. That's something we do at Redeemer every Sunday. We write a confession of sin. And then a pastor would hand me the bread and the wine of communion and say, Jesus loves you. And he said, looking back, that was probably more important to me than all the big philosophical conversations we had, because the question I was asking was, does Jesus love me as a real person? And it doesn't matter what someone says to you online, they will never be able to answer that question in a disembodied way. And I think only the church can answer that question. And that's why Jesus gave us the gift of the church.
Well, I'm curious. Would it be fair to say your church has more of a liturgical vibe? And I because just talking to various authors the past few years who are writing and speaking into this space, one of the things that always strikes me is if we look at the average modern evangelical church, we've lost spiritual practices, we've lost creeds and confessions, we've lost art in the sanctuary. Like there's very little that connects us into kind of the ancient roots of the faith, regular communion, all these different things. Like, are there a range of things besides what you just described that pull people into that maybe more ancient faith tradition? Because again, growing up Lutheran as well, very very familiar with more liturgical settings. Have a lot of Catholics in my family as well. The vanilla evangelical experience today in America is far different and very disconnected from more the roots of the faith, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Our tradition is a little bit more liturgical, and so that has been something that's important to me, not only because it's ancient, which I do think that in an era where I think people are looking for rootedness, I think that's a word you use, Shaun, rootedness. I think if you end up in a warehouse kind of church where everything sounds and looks and feels like the things you experience outside of those walls, I don't think that's going to be particularly attractive to this generation because it's not rooted. It's all new. And one of the points I try to make in the book is, about my experience of being in a very relevant youth group. It's very relevant. And we would walk into youth group. There's probably 600 students there every single night. There were dirt bikes. I don't know why there were dirt bikes, but there were dirt bikes there, and they were doing tricks. And we would walk in, and it felt very much like a Nickelodeon show. I mean, I loved it as a 16-year-old, and the pastor, he would stand up and he would say things like, you have a dream that God has laid on your heart, and he wants you to fulfill that dream. He wants you to accomplish that dream in life. And as a 16-year-old, that's the sweetest sentence you can hear. I have all these dreams in life. Jesus wants those things for me. Great. But what I found over the years is that that thing that felt very relevant to me when life hit me very hard became totally irrelevant. And so a couple of formative experiences for me, my senior year of high school, were I took a mission trip to South Africa, and I experienced extreme poverty. Never seen extreme poverty, like not homelessness in America. I mean, people who lived in tin sheds, who were eating bone broth for dinner every night. And some of them were Christian, some of them were non-Christian. And I thought, okay, so here are these Christians. They're probably the most hospitable, kindest people I've ever met. And you're telling me that what, God doesn't love them because their dreams aren't fulfilled. This doesn't track with my experience in life. And then returning home a couple of weeks later and finding my youngest brother one day had drowned in our backyard pool. And I thought, wow, if God's goal is to meet all my dreams, he's doing a pretty bad job of it, because this is a nightmare. It's a nightmare for me. It's a nightmare for them. And so what felt so relevant to me for 2 years became instantly irrelevant, because it felt good, it sounded good, but I had no rootedness. I had nothing to cling on to. And so that was really a big part of my disillusionment in leaving the church. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for today is not shallow relevance, but really rootedness.
And in terms of, I guess we'll say American evangelicalism, if you will. Like, what if you had to list like the top three things that seem to be pushing people away, or that they just got so frustrated that like that was the last straw? Like, what is it about modern churches here in the States that is just sending people, far outside the doors and far away, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, I think that I think we've got the mission wrong. So I think that in many ways, I talk about two extremes in the book. One is the extreme of our job is to be as exclusive as possible. We want you to look and sound and think as much like us as possible. I don't know if you're familiar, Shaun, with Tim Alberta or his book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. He was a journalist for the Atlantic for a period of time. But one of the stories he talked about, so I worked actually at Tim Alberta, his father's church in Brighton, Michigan. And one of the things that happened just down the street from this church, which was very healthy, very orthodox, large EPC church, is that a small, literally a house that was maybe a block away from my house. A new pastor came in town. This a little bit after COVID started, and every Sunday started spouting conspiracy theories. And almost overnight, this church blew up. It became a mega church. And so you have thousands of people coming to this church. And I think that in some ways that works temporarily. Uh, but then you have the 40 million people who've left. And what are they leaving over? Well, they see that and they say, oh, I see. So this is what church was all along. It was about trying to be this exclusive movement where if you believe what we believe about all these things, it has nothing to do with Jesus. It has nothing to do with what the global historic church has always said and believed and practiced. And that was one of the things that I found so helpful. I'm so lucky to have gone to seminary. I didn't want to go to seminary. My pastor made me go to seminary, but I'm so lucky that I did because one of my mentors, Rick Lentz, he in our Theology 1 class, the class where you're supposed to learn about the Trinity and the resurrection and the basics, he just talked about the history of American evangelicalism the whole first semester. Like, here's why we think the way that we think. Here's who we are. And I realized, oh, actually, all these things I grew up with, they're just a little blip on the screen of what the global historic church has been. And they're almost out of line with what that thing is. And so one of my resolves during that time was I want to be part of a church that at least cares about what the capital C church is all over the world and all through history. And I think that sense of shallowness, probably from both ends, is really what people are falling away from. I think, and I'm glad. I think it's a good thing.
Well, I love that your pastor made you go to the seminary. Like, one of the things I've observed, and I work with tons of authors who have ministries or are pastors, but I've met so many people during my 11 years in Christian publishing where they were homegrown. They came up inside the congregation. They, started leading in the youth group, and then they did this and they did that. And they'll get to these places as teaching pastors and various pastoral roles in the church, but they have zero Bible college, no seminary education. And I've seen churches where you get to a place where there's literally nobody on the staff that has a seminary level Bible education, which I feel like it just leaves you open to go into ditches and weird error. And not that people have bad intentions, but when you lack the depth of training you're going to get in seminary, I feel like it's important to have at least some people on staff who've been to seminary. But that seems like it's just not as much of a norm, maybe, as it was when I was in Bible college, 25 years ago, whenever that was. Things are just different these days. I'm curious in terms of your experience, like why? I mean, I get kind of why your pastor sent you to a seminary, but like, why was that important to him? Because a lot of senior leaders don't think that way these days.
Yeah, it was important for him because I wanted to go into ministry. And I think what he knew that I didn't know at the time is how much my own. So, one of the things that Rick Lentz would always say is you bring the Bible's authoritative, the Bible's God's word, and you bring a sinful bias when you read the Bible, and you bring a cultural bias to reading the Bible. And the only way you can escape that sinful bias and cultural bias is to be in conversation with the Christians who've gone before you and Christians around the world, because they will point out to you where you're misreading or you're skipping parts and you don't want to hear it. But unfortunately, to even get to that place, I had to have a very bad experience at I won't even call it a church. It was really more of a cult here on the south side of Indianapolis, where it was the pastor. And by the way, this is my favorite articulation of the evangelical vibe ever. So the pastor did not have a Bible degree. He didn't have a seminary degree, and he had come up with this very strange way of reading the Bible, where he stood up one Sunday and said, "You're no longer allowed to teach Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because Jesus he didn't understand the gospel. Paul understood the gospel, so we're only going to teach." Actually, Paul didn't really understand the gospel until the last few years of his life. So you can only teach the last few letters that Paul wrote. And I thought, how in the world did we get here? What would have someone have said 100 years ago if we had presented this teaching to them? But it's because he didn't see how his own culture and his own sin was influencing the way that he was reading the Bible. And actually, what was behind that is this very abusive culture that was in the church. And so what we did was we skipped all the ethics of the Bible and we tried to focus on what he called the gospel. And so one particular Sunday really stands out to me in this church where I was working with maybe 60 or 70 low income students, and we had an after school program. I started playing some Christian rap for them as they walked in, just to get the vibes right. And I heard some stomping noise from the offices upstairs, and I thought, okay, something must be wrong. I started to walk upstairs, and the pastor was running downstairs, and his face was beet red. And he listened to some of the music, and he said, "Well, what is this crap?" And I said, "Well, it's Christian rap music. It's kind of what our students listen to, so I thought it would be good." And he said, "Well, if I can't understand it, it's not Christian." And little does he know, I've put that in my pocket, and I thought, oh, I think that's the real Christian worldview in evangelicalism. If I can't understand it, it's not Christian. And so I think that's what can happen when it's just me and my Bible, is that we start to take all of our personality, all of our cultural bias, all of our sinful bias, and we say, oh, that's what the Bible's all about. So you need that global historic community. And that, to me, that's what seminary gave me. It gave me a conversation with people beyond my culture, and I needed that.
And let's move in just a real practical direction for a moment. Whether it's just the average person on the street, individual who has a friend or a family member who's walking through a spiritual crisis, a season of disillusionment, kind of trying to figure out the sorts of things we've been talking about, or maybe you're a pastor at a church and somebody comes to you for a meeting and it's just all of a sudden unloads, "I'm having this massive faith crisis." How do we walk through those sorts of things? Because one, those conversations, I feel like they can be awkward no matter who you are. I know so many people will say, "Well, I was never trained in how to respond to this or what to do with this." Like this, we didn't have it. How do I respond to deconstruction class in seminary, if you will? What does it look like to be present, to listen, to ask the right questions? Like, how do we do that in a loving way that's just not weird or awkward? Because it's a challenging conversation to have with anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things I'll say often to parents who have children who are walking away from faith is that, and I've walked through this process with lots of people, and I have some hard stories. I have some stories of people who've walked away, but I've been through a lot of these conversations where I've really seen someone turn around and find renewal. And I would say maybe the difference in the way that I approach those conversations and some of those who've been unsuccessful with those folks approach those conversations is that my goal in my first several conversations, and sometimes this can take a month, sometimes it can take a year, sometimes it can take a couple of years, is to get to the place where I can genuinely say to this person who's deconstructing, I understand how you got where you are. I get it. I'm not saying I agree. I'm not saying we don't have a lot more conversations to have, but I can see it from your perspective. And I genuinely understand why you are where you are right now. And there's something about being able to get to that conversation and even being able to say, here's how I've experienced some of those things that you're describing. That's why the whole first half of my book is really just trying to say, hey, I think you're right about a lot of your criticisms. One of the things my coworker Sam Heist, he's a pastor on staff, and he's so good with this crowd. I'd say 70% of our church are people who felt disillusionment or have deconstructed at some point, but have come back to the faith. Is he'll say, really, I spend my first several sessions with someone who's deconstructing saying, I agree with you. You're right. And I just think there's something when you try to skip past that process and get to the answers and you become defensive. There's something very anxiety inducing about that for both of you, and it's just not going to get anywhere. And so you don't have to have a seminary degree to do that. You just have to be able to be someone who, you mentioned some of those things, Shaun. How do you become patient and how do you ask the right questions? If that's your goal, is being able to say, I understand how you got where you got, I think it will change the trajectory of every conversation you have afterward.
And we already touched on, at your church, it's more of a liturgical experience, with you will, or if you will. I'd love to have you take us into kind of like what is the role of, say, like beauty, imagination, spiritual wonder, like how does that play a role in healing people who say have lost faith in a religious system? Because again, I think of all those things, and I feel like a lot of that's absent in the Christianity that's presented in American evangelicalism pretty broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things I'm very thankful for is being part of a church that really values beauty. So our church, Redeemer, was started many years ago, but it was originally a studio for artists that was purchased by some people who are trying to plant a church. And rather than kick the artists out, essentially said, "Well, let's just make this part of what we do. Is we house artists in our church." And so, if you walk into our church, you will see a lot of art. Most of it is not Christian. Some of it is shocking and intentionally so. This is not precious moments. There are some great Christian artists. One of them is Kyle. I tell a little bit of his story in the book. Kyle's an elder at our church. He's a prominent artist here in Indianapolis. Um, but the reason why Kyle values beauty is because Kyle he really believes that the gospel is not just something for our spirits, but it's for our whole bodies. It's for our lives. And so we go through the liturgical seasons like Advent and Easter and things like that. And something that Kyle will say is, he says, I think that the world God made, I think it's meant to point to Jesus, which is really something that every church father would have said. I think this whole earth is meant to point to Jesus. So when it's springtime, there's no coincidence that in the West we celebrate Easter during springtime. That is literally about the resurrection. And so one of the neat things we did a year ago was we were talking about the incarnation of Jesus and talking about Advent. And so Kyle and the liturgical team, we said, all right, go do something about Jesus becoming human. And so we walk into church and there are crocheted sculptures of women's, I guess crochets of women's pregnant bodies, very detailed. It's not the type of thing you typically find in an evangelical church. And you have wooden DNA sculptures of the helix and things like this. And I have had so many people who said when they walked into that atmosphere and they saw real beauty and creativity and risk, not just plastic evangelical art, they already started to feel a sense of healing. Oh, this is a little bit different. And I think we underestimate how much that embodied picture of the gospel can really affect people's process of renewal and redemption.
I want to make sure we touch on the idea of becoming restoried. And I kind of alluded to this earlier too, in terms of just what we see in culture. Most people have lost the plot of what story they're a part of, again, because they've been pushed away from their family, the faith of their family, their country's bad, all the things. And when any of us walk through those seasons, we feel listless. We don't know where to belong or where to go. What is that process of restoried kind of writing that new path, however I want to say it. What does that look like?
Yeah. So one of the conversations I talk about in the book is with a student named Michael. This is back when I was doing campus ministry at the University of Missouri. And so for 2 years, I met with Michael, and he was asking me lots of very difficult apologetic questions. And I was giving him what I thought were pretty good answers. I still think they're pretty good answers to his questions. And yet every time I answered his question, he would have this dead look in his eyes, like, okay, fine. So you answered that question. It's not really doing anything for me. And so we did that for about 2 years. And then one particular day, I kind of sat down with Michael, and he said something that caught my attention. He said, "Oh, um, I'm an artist, and of course, that's not a very Christian thing to do, is to create art. And that I should be doing more important things. Like I know I should be evangelizing all the time." And I said, "Okay, Michael, I do think you should be evangelizing, but what makes you say that your art isn't a particularly Christian idea? What were you told the gospel was?" And so we just happened to be in a very beautiful part of the city while we were having that conversation. We were up on a rooftop. I remember it was fall time because we could see the leaves on the trees all red and gold and green. And I said to Michael, "Okay, look around the city right now. This is God's painting. You paint. You love your paintings, right?" And he said, "Oh, some of them." I was like, "Okay, well, you love the paintings that you love. God made this world. What would make you think that He hated you creating beauty? I mean, He created beauty." And Michael's answer is super profound. He said, "Well, if God's goal is really for me to just get to heaven, then I don't see how any of these other things really matter." And it may have surprised him, but I said, "Oh, you're right about that, actually." You're right. I just don't think that's God's goal for you. Because what he was articulating was the story of escape. It's one of the things I talk about in the book. I think it's been the prominent story for American evangelicals over the last century. It's not the same gospel story that's told by evangelicals all around the world. It's not even the gospel story evangelicals were telling over a century ago. This idea that Jesus' main goal is to get us out of our bodies into a place called heaven. And so we started walking through what I would say is Jesus' pronouncement of the gospel, which is not this gospel of escape, but it's about heaven coming down to earth. It's about the resurrection. Little do we know, one of the most controversial things about Paul the Apostle wasn't that he was proclaiming Jesus as Lord. It was that he was proclaiming a resurrection from the dead. That was scandalous to Greco-Roman philosophers because it felt so carnal. The physical body, you're saying God cares about creation? No, creation is evil. And one of Paul's big assertions, no, creation is good. God hasn't come to help us leave creation. He's come to redeem creation. And so one of the things I said to Michael, and I was just really repeating an early church father Tertullian when I said that, is I said, "Michael, if your gospel is true, here's my one problem with it. God doesn't love you. That's my only problem with it, is that God doesn't love you if it's true that God doesn't care about your body, your emotions, your interests, the world around you." And so as I articulated this different vision of Jesus renewing and restoring and resurrecting everything, I mean, there's just tears down Michael's face. And I realized I've been missing that part of the conversation for 2 years. He'd been trying to live out of the wrong story, and he didn't understand the gospel is about Jesus renewing all things through his life, death, and resurrection.
And I think as people have gotten this far in the conversation, they've hopefully picked up that your book is hopeful. It's not cynical. If you had to kind of sum it up in terms of your hope for the future of Christianity, the faith here in America, if you will, amongst younger generations, like what are the things you see that are making you hopeful? Because again, even in the book, you talk about while we have so many people that are moving away from the faith, we have massive amounts of people coming into the church at the same time. So it's not this completely dire picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel encouraged. I feel like it's surgery, and I think Jesus is doing something special right now in our country in particular. And so, yes, I do feel encouraged. I do think that Jesus is creating renewal in the church. And my hope really, I got an email last week, which is really beautiful. It was someone who had just read the book. They finished it. They had not been part of a church for many, many years. And they said, "I called my employer and I said, I need to have Sundays off because I need to go back to church." And my prayer is for that person. But my prayer is also, one of the interesting things that's happened is that folks who are in that space of feeling disillusioned or deconstructing are handing this book to their parents and saying, "This will help you understand me." And so I think two things are happening there. I think Jesus is bringing people into his church, but I think Jesus is also inviting us as a church to experience the fullness and beauty of the gospel. Because I think a lot of those reasons people are leaving are really, if we're willing to be self-critical and if we're willing to say, hey, where are the places where we need to repent, I think is an opportunity for us to experience renewal as well.
And in terms of connecting with you, finding out more about the book, all the things, where can we find you on the web?
Yeah, so I have a Substack called The Bard Owl, Bard Owl, and that's a great place to connect with me and to read some. I put out a weekly article. I try to collect some things around the web or culture that I'm thinking about, but it's a good way to get in contact with me as well, especially if you've read the book. I love to hear from readers and things they're thinking about and experiencing as they read.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to Nick's Substack, as well as places where you can pick up your very own copy of this brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Our book today was The Light in Our Eyes, Rediscovering the Love, Beauty, and Freedom of Jesus in an Age of Disillusionment. And Nick, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
Absolutely. It has been mine as well. Thanks, Sean.